Welcome to How We Hope, a show where two friends dig into an aspect of hope we've been grappling with, talk to people who inspire us, and look for reasons to be hopeful. I'm Betsy.
And I'm Lena. For this episode, we are going to dive into climate. I feel like climate is one of the hardest things for me personally to feel hopeful about.
Yeah, me too. The headlines I associate with climate are always about people losing their homes to floods and fires and polar bears dying. It's very dire.
Climate is one of those issues that has like a million child issues, and all of them are scary, and we don't know which ones to focus on. And then on
Mhm.
top of all that, there's all these people in government who are saying that we don't even have to worry about climate.
Right.
Um, so that is tough.
Mhm.
Do you
True.
do
Fact.
you do you think that you would ever be able to work in climate activism?
I think that considering that I'm very comfortable being an investigative journalist who no one expects to be happy, my answer would be no. Because when my friends ask me what stories I'm working on, they generally know to expect a fairly depressing response. But if I were a climate activist and people generally thought of me as a bummer, I think it would mean that I wasn't very good at what I did.
Yeah, I think I would really struggle with trying to communicate some sort of positivity while being constantly confronted with the pessimistic reality of how hard it is to make progress. So, in this episode, I am going to dig into a more scientific reason for why it feels so hard to feel hopeful about climate. And then I am going to talk to my friend Ricky, who is a climate activist, and see what I can learn from him. The first person I talked to is Dr. Claire Robertson. She is an associate professor at Colby College and studies media, attention, and polarization. I wanted to talk to her to better understand how our media and attention patterns make us hold on to these really depressing images of climate change and make it hard for us to be optimistic about progress. She published a paper in 2023 that found that people are more likely to click on a headline that's framed in a negative way rather than a positive way, even when we control for the topic in the headline. It seems like there's this tension. Readers conceptually are like, I want good news, but then they don't actually engage with it. So I'm curious if you could talk a little bit more about why there's this tension.
There is an ocean of literature in psychology showing that, to put it very simply, bad is stronger than good. And this really goes back to the fact that evolutionarily, way, way, way back, it was more adaptive. It let us live longer if we were over attuned to threats compared to under attuned, right?
Mm.
So if you have two people and these two people, one's over attuned, one's under attuned, and it's just kind of a 4x4 survives or not, right? We see a squirrel, we think it's a snake. One person overreacts, they get really scared and they jump
Mhm.
back. They live. The person who's underreacting, they don't really care. They also live. It's a squirrel. It's not actually something that's threatening, right? The snake, if we think we see a snake and it is actually a snake, the person who's overreacting jumps back, avoids getting bitten, they live. The person who doesn't care, not attuned, they don't jump back, they get bitten, they die.
Yeah.
So the problem is evolution is not directive. It's good enough. It's always just going to try to get us to a good enough point where we can survive. So we are hardwired to over perceive these threats.
This makes sense. And when you are applying it to news media, people are just attuned to remember and react to more negative news.
Yeah, I feel like none of that is super surprising to us as journalists. But something that I found really interesting is Dr. Robertson's point about how this dynamic has actually gone a lot worse in recent years with the attention economy. Because back in the day, when people just got a newspaper, the goal was to get people to buy the newspaper. So maybe you could make the headline on the front page kind of clickbaity, kind of negative, but the rest of the paper didn't have those same incentives. But now on social media, you are constantly fighting for people's attention, and it really creates this algorithmic media doom spiral.
I think that switch from a goods for money to attention is the money and the good is entertainment, that has shifted the paradigm so much. And it's really happened in the last 100 years. And when we think about evolution, again, to like hammer home this point, the shift from hunter-gatherer to agriculture, which took thousands of years, that was considered fast on an evolutionary scale. So the amount of change that we have gone through in the last 100 years socially for the social parts of our brains is light speed. It's crazy.
Mm-hmm.
And so we are not able to keep up for the most part with these changes to our environment. And that leads to what's called an evolutionary mismatch.
You know, anytime a researcher or a medical professional responds to a question about a problem we're facing in society with, we're acting the way cavemen would if you just gave them a bunch of iPads after they returned from a day of hunting woolly mammoths. I'm like, this is really all starting to make sense. It feels like getting a diagnosis, and that's great. It makes me feel actually not crazy.
Yeah, totally. And it also removes the personal problem element of it. Do you find it hopeful at all to know that on this intellectual level, things aren't as bad as they seem and it's just your brain tricking you?
I do. I do. When I think about it, I actually don't remember reading a single positive story about climate change. There has to be one out there that I have come across, but I can't recall it. And I also think that the algorithms that dictate our internet and social media, and therefore our news reading habits, make things really hard. If they are only continuing to encourage and amplify the worst and the most depressing headlines, how exactly are people supposed to overcome that?
Totally. That is why I wanted to dig into the psyche of someone who has worked in climate activism because I'm sure every day they are also thinking about how they can break through this noise and get people to
Mm.
believe in climate solutions. So I talked to my friend Ricky Huang. Ricky is someone I have always seen as so immensely dedicated to the climate cause, both in his career and lifestyle. He has since moved to Taiwan, but when I met him, we both lived in New York. And I remember he would consistently commute like 45 minutes to go to a zero waste grocery store. And he was always reading about climate and organizing climate action groups and meeting with politicians about that crisis. And through all of this, he just seems really hopeful and optimistic to me.
Which is an accomplishment considering the work that he does. I have never met Ricky, but seeing him tap dance on stage during a performance in college made me smile for the rest of the day. I definitely perceive Ricky as someone who radiates a lot of joy and positivity just as a human.
Yeah, definitely a positive guy all around. To run down some of the work that he is currently doing, he is spearheading the development of a climate policy package for Taiwan that's inspired by the US Inflation Reduction Act. He's also the co founder of the Taiwan Youth Climate Coalition, which is a network of youth climate activists. And he's helping launch Rewiring the World, a global initiative to build an energy transition toolkit. On top of that, he is working with partners across the Asia Pacific countries to foster a resilient energy supply chain. He is definitely a busy man, so I feel lucky to have been able to have a conversation with him about his relationship with hope and how he thinks about hope in climate action. So, Ricky, what is your relationship with hope?
I am both a very pessimistic and a very optimistic person. I'm trying very hard to square those two extremes in my mind. I'm extremely pessimistic about a future scenario in which we don't try our best to create a net zero future. And I'm quite optimistic about the solutions we have at hand or the solutions that we're going to create to achieve a future scenario that is not the worst case scenario in my mind.
Throughout this interview, Ricky talked a lot about this book called No Impact Man by Colin Bevan that influenced him to dedicate his life to climate. The premise is this man decides to try to go 1 year having as little impact on the climate as possible. It gets pretty extreme. He's living in New York, and at some point, they stop using electricity. He is trying to do this while he has a wife and a child. And one of the concepts that Ricky learned from this book is this idea of the positive feedback loop in climate.
In climate science, a positive feedback loop is a feedback loop where something reinforces itself and becomes stronger and stronger, and it makes the problem worse and worse. So just to give you a well-known example, there's something called the albedo effect. It's basically when global warming intensifies, it will further melt the ice caps. And ice sheets are known to have a pretty high albedo, meaning that it can reflect the sunlight pretty well. So if the ice sheets melt, the area that can reflect sunlight would shrink, which means that the area of the ocean that absorbs more sunlight would expand. So this would further accelerate the process of heating up the earth and further shrinks the ice sheet and further accelerates this process. So there are a lot of these positive feedback loops in the earth system. The scary thing is that scientists actually know very little about these systems. So when I learned about that concept, of course, I was aware of climate change and global warming before reading that book. But I was like, oh my gosh, like we don't even know how bad the situation is going to be because we know so little about these systems, right? So what if our worst case scenario right now is actually our best case scenario, and there might be something worse that might happen if we don't actually get this right? I feel like we are all very familiar with the polar bears and the sea turtles and all of these like fear-invoking images that look very scary, but like if you really think about it, for the average person, this is something that is very far away. But I feel like this concept is substantive and it's a new concept. So I reacted very, very strongly to it.
So I think this helps explain the pessimism aspect of Ricky's psyche, where he just feels this really intense urgency about climate because he's like, we don't even know how bad this could get. But at the same time, he has a lot of optimism about the solutions that he's working on.
But I think we definitely have the tools at hand to tackle this problem. In fact, I don't even think that our biggest hurdle is technological. Some of the greatest barriers to effective climate action is more psychological or social or
Mm.
political. I think we have the technical technologies. We have probably like 90% or 95% of them to actually tackle this problem, but we don't really have the social or the political or the psychological technologies to help the public, to help industry, to help the government weather this challenge.
It's kind of nice to learn that the people in your life who you perceive as hopeful struggle to be hopeful as well, while, like Ricky, making moves to work on solutions. That is really refreshing.
It seems like he has that perfect combination of pessimism about how bad it could get, plus optimism about the potential solutions at hand, which helps explain why he is so dedicated to the climate cause. There is another concept that this book touches on that Ricky said influenced him, which is our bias towards convenience.
Towards the end of the book, he was talking about how his experiment with his family has transformed his thinking about climate in general. Basically, his point is that we are constantly stuck in a hedonic treadmill to pursue happiness and convenience. For example, we choose to drive faster cars. We buy cars instead of taking public transit, instead of biking or walking. We have food delivery instead of, like making our own food or going to a restaurant in hopes of saving more time. But what are you going to do with that time? Well, you might just scroll on your phone, you might watch Netflix, maybe you spend that time working for an extra hour. But what are you going to use the money you earn with that extra hour? Probably you might just rechannel that into more convenience, right? So ultimately, you're stuck in this hedonic treadmill of constantly trying to look for happiness, constantly trying to look for convenience. But after we reach a certain level of happiness, we get used to it. We need more to satiate ourselves. So ultimately, we're not even feeling happy anymore. We're not even enjoying the convenience anymore. So his solution to that is, okay, maybe you might think that a climate-friendly action, biking or taking the bus, is something that is inconvenient. But if you reframe it, it can actually bring you extreme happiness because it is fundamentally a more heterogeneous experience, right? Like on a bus, there are many different kinds of people. You can observe all these different situations all the time. It's constantly a changing landscape. You get to meet other people, different people. So there's a higher potential of more diversity in your life. And that is ultimately what is going to drive your happiness. So I think he takes a very different approach to, like making people think about these climate actions. And I feel like that is also something that really inspired me. And I was actually, inspired by that to constantly look for not only decarbonization in my own lifestyle, I try to also find those surprising experiences that could contribute to my happiness.
It's a really interesting reason why climate is challenging for us in society to care about. I don't especially like hiking or backpacking, but on the rare occasion that I do, that's when I realize how conditioned I've become to constantly seek out convenience, warmth, air conditioning, a flat surface to sit on, all of the things that you don't have when you're in the middle of the forest. It's something that you don't even think about when you live in a city.
Yeah, I love convenience. But I also think, living in New York, I am often faced with inconvenient situations. Like
Mm,
you are always having to walk to get groceries and then haul them back home, take the train, and you're always encountering crazy people on the streets. And that is also kind of the joy of New York is you never really know who you're going to encounter. It feels like anything could happen at any point. So there is something to that seeking out variety of experience that I feel like I felt in my own life.
hmm
Ricky actually related this idea of the hedonic treadmill and seeking out diversity of experience to how he feels about his work. So he was talking about how climate is such a gnarly problem that you can tackle from so many different angles, from a policy angle, from an economic angle, from a communications angle. And for him, every day is so diverse that it actually is very hopeful and interesting and fulfilling as a career for him to pursue.
mm
But at the same time, even though he gave this spiel about how we should seek out a variety of experiences, I think he knows that this may not be a winning strategy to get people to change their actions and pursue climate solutions. So he has also thought a lot about the communication of climate strategies. I'm curious what your experience has been with thinking about the media's role of covering climate and if you think there are ways that the media can combat the psychological negativity bias everyone has.
Right. I think this is a extremely important question. This is also something that we're grappling a lot with right now because I feel like the most difficult aspect of my work, at least, is communications. To be honest, it is hard because climate change, although it is a very big and horrible problem, the time scale at which it is happening is oftentimes incongruent with the time span that we are able to comprehend. This is not to say that climate change will take decades or even centuries. It's like the everyday events in our lives, it has a very tricky relationship with climate change. So just to give you an example, I live in central Taiwan. We have had torrential rain for more than a week. It has caused a lot of flooding. It has caused a lot of deaths. But you can't really say that this is 100% because of climate change, because climate change is an overarching issue. It influences a lot of different aspects of the Earth system, but you can never say that it is a direct causation. It might be high correlation, but it is never a direct causation. I think it is rather easy to focus on the negative things about climate change because we don't really know how else to talk about it. And also, I hate to say this, but the negative things tend to be the sexier part of climate. Like, people don't really care, just to be honest, about the solutions because it's not really relevant to your life oftentimes. So in my mind, in order to overcome this psychological hurdle, we need to declimatize climate. We need to declimatize climate solutions and declimatize climate policies.
Declimatizing climate to Ricky means to talk about climate, but not with a climate framing. So, the way that he thinks about advocating for climate policies is to tie climate to a different issue like national security or economic development without invoking the word climate.
That makes sense to me. I've encountered that as a health and environment reporter. Climate change would fall within the umbrella of my coverage. And the very intentional angle that I chose for anything climate related is to cover how it affects people's health. I felt like that was how I could make the impact of global warming relevant to an audience that might not care or might be used to tuning out as soon as you mentioned the word climate. I actually might have been one of those people because I understand how important this issue is, but I don't know. Hearing the word climate kind of makes me yawn. Probably shouldn't say that. But I definitely don't use the word climate in those stories because I don't need to. And I think it's an important part of a journalist's job to find new ways to communicate about issues that audiences might be tired of hearing about.
Yeah, Dr. Robertson actually talked about something really similar.
There's also a lot of psychological evidence. Negativity, threatening content, it travels through networks faster. It sticks in our heads. We use it more to create judgments about people, all of that. So these things, once they're kind of with us, they're really with us. They're hard to overcome. It's really hard.
When you think about a term like climate, it is so loaded and it creates such a cloud of emotional response to the point where people can't really approach it in a rational way. So, with many climate solutions, once we use the term like fighting climate change, it immediately alienates one audience and then it causes another audience to tune it out.
Given the political situation and the geopolitical situation that we're in right now, it is a highly volatile, highly polarized situation. So for us, in order to ensure that the policy that we help implement is sustainable beyond a 4-year term, we have to make it so that it sticks for different demographics. It sticks for different political parties. And I think the only way to do that is to declimatize climate.
It's frustrating that we can't pursue climate solutions for the sake of reducing the number of people who lose their homes in wildfires and floods. And instead, we have to pretend it's about GDP growth or something like that.
The economy rules all.
This is true.
It is also food for thought, though, that there could be some climate progress going on that just isn't being framed in that way. So if I'm on a news site and I'm looking for positive stories about the climate, maybe they're just not coming up, but there is progress happening somewhere. I ended my conversation with Ricky asking if there are things in climate that he currently finds really hopeful.
Yeah, I honestly feel like no matter how hopeless the situation might seem, I think to every problem, there is another side of the coin. So just to give you an example, the whole world right now is mired in this really tricky situation, trying to negotiate with the US on the tariff issue. And this has honestly sucked up a lot of air from climate and from a lot of other issues. This might also potentially make climate solutions harder because some solutions might be more expensive. But I feel like there's also an opportunity to look at this and be like, oh, actually, in order to make ourselves more resilient against these kind of volatilities, we can do certain things that are not only good for climate, but also good for economic and energy resilience. So for example, one of the projects that I'm working on is a energy supply chain project. How can nations like Taiwan or Australia or South Korea, Japan, etc., think about our respective advantages when it comes to energy supply chain? How can we work together to reconstruct a more resilient energy supply chain such that A, we can create both more supply and demand within our own region, such that we can develop more economic resilience against international volatility that involves other regions. B, how can we even provide more of these solutions to other regions? For example, more of these solutions to the United States, especially when the US is in a rather fraught relationship with China. Are there alternative products that can be made in our region or in other regions that can be a better alternative to the US or to Europe?
So in this case, Ricky is saying that even though tariffs are making things more expensive and maybe making some of these solutions harder in the short term, it might bring more attention to the need for resilience in the long term.
It might be 2 steps forward, 1 step back, but I feel like with that step back, there's always the potential to step 2 steps forward again in the future, or even more steps going forward. So I feel like that makes me very hopeful. And I think it is because of events like this that would galvanize climate activists or even more people to think of more creative ways that would ultimately make policies even more sustainable. Every, like seemingly negative developments that are happening in our world can be an opportunity. And we need to seize every single one of these opportunities and make it a reality.
That's an incredible reframe, and my therapist would be proud of Ricky.
Yeah, I don't want to take it lightly. I don't want to be like, Ricky is just delusional, you know? Even if I don't share the same level of positive reframing that he does. I do think there is something real about how every solution can lay a little seed that can potentially advance climate solutions in the future as long as we are smart about responding. The last thing that I wanted to cover is what we personally can do to be more positive about what we're seeing on the internet about climate. Because I don't want people, including myself, to fall into this doomism cycle of feeling overwhelmed by negative headlines and also feeling like we're surrounded by climate deniers. So, Dr. Robertson talked about one way that we can shield ourselves from this feeling on social media.
My husband and I will sometimes say, we call it big they, like big tobacco or big oil. We'll say, oh, big they is mad about this, right? Because it's not really a group that is meaningful to us. There are people who are
Yeah.
mad, but there's a lot of people who have far more nuanced, reasonable opinions. And
Yeah.
we're finding that in the lab. We're finding that in some real world data that we have. Literally this past week, got some cross-cultural data showing that this really holds up across different countries. This effect of extremity being the most vocal people seems quite robust. And it distorts how we perceive others, how we think other people are thinking about the world. It can make us feel really isolated. But you are not alone. In fact, you are probably in the majority if you feel overwhelmed or worn down sometimes by these really vitriolic arguments.
This is a really good reminder that the extremes that we see on social media just don't reflect the world that exists around us. And it's also probably a good reminder to just talk to people instead of assuming that the angriest people online are the way people are in their
Yeah.
everyday life.
Yeah, I really like her term big they. I think I'm going to use that in the future. We covered a lot of ground in this episode, so I want to recap. We started by exploring why it's hard to feel positive. It is not your fault, it is literally your evolutionary wiring. But there are some real ways to reframe how you're thinking. So, first is to be aware of this bias. When you're thinking about recent news, it's helpful to be aware that our brains are tricking us to fixate on negative stories. It's also helpful when you're thinking about people's responses to the news on social media to remember that the crazies on the internet are not the average person in the world. Second, we can channel Ricky and really think about how to reframe. When you're reading news that isn't climate related, you can think about the way that it might impact climate progress and even start to advocate for some of those solutions yourself. And on a personal level, you could think about ways to get off the hedonic treadmill and introduce more variety in your life. Betsy, what is the most hopeful thing that you've taken away from this episode?
The most hopeful thing that I find in all of this is that someone like Ricky is dedicating his life to working on climate. Seeing how motivated he is to change things reminds me that you can be and feel pessimistic and hopeless, and you can still work on solutions at the same time.
Yeah. I am going to try and remember that, as implausible as it might seem at any given time. Our one step back currently could enable 2 steps forward in the future. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of How We Hope, a show distributed by Grab Bag Collab. As always, we would love to hear thoughts and reactions in our inbox, howwehopepodcast@gmail.com.